Today, we're going to learn how to leak data to the entire internet. Okay, quick note. Sorry about the hat. I had some skin cancer removed last week, and there's a bit of a scar, so this just covers it up. Don't worry, once it's healed a little bit more, we'll get rid of it, and everything is going to be fine. It's just it ended up being a little bit bigger than I expected. With that said, let's move back into our discussion on data security. And I need to remind you guys that I am not the most subtle of individuals on the face of the planet. I like my hammers. And once again, I'm going to remind you of the two biggest sources of cloud security breaches, because our guiding light is making sure any of our security defenses are aligned with real world attacks and real world issues. First is those lost, stolen, and exposed credentials, and the other is that public facing stuff. And when it comes to public facing stuff, there is not a larger source of historical data leaks than Amazon S3. And the wild part of it is, this isn't because Amazon S3 gets hacked. It's never been hacked. It's because somebody puts data into S3, and even though it defaults being totally private, they make the data public. Yeah, that's a thing. And it's honestly for understandable reasons. Now, the good news is Amazon has added multiple layers and defaults to make it much harder to accidentally expose data in S3, but mistakes still happen. And the crux of the issue is that there's some very legitimate reasons to expose data to the internet using S3. I mean, it's actually one of the best features of the service, and I use it all the time, including those CloudFormation templates that we use for this training program. Now, as security nerds, our challenge is to understand how and why these public exposures occur and how to find and remediate the unapproved public disclosures and prevent inadvertent ones from moving forward. Now, look, I could have built this lesson in lab completely around the tools that we use to identify and block public access at a very high level, but that doesn't help you understand the how and why of how it occurs in the first place. And thus, we're going to start with a couple of labs on how to make things public. Then we'll switch gears into detection and prevention. So here's what you need to know about S3. And it's just a really quick overview. The power of S3, the simple storage service, is that it allows you to store massive amounts of data and even provide direct internet access to that data. We use it to replace web servers, to host images, serve up data, or store massive amounts of our internal data that's not meant to be out there in public on the internet. S3, it's the honey badger of storage. It don't care what you throw at it. Its job is to never back down. As I mentioned before, it defaults to everything being private, but technically anything in S3 can be made public over the internet. And this is by design. And due to the high numbers of these inadvertent disclosures, Amazon has continued to add a variety of security controls and defaults to make you jump through a lot of hoops before you can actually make it public. That said, we see it just happening all the time. S3, it's highly scalable, highly available, highly durable object storage. That's what we call this. It's object storage. Now, what makes object storage different from traditional file systems? Well, you organize data in a file system using directories and files. Object storage treats data as distinct objects, and each object has the data itself, the metadata describing the object, and then a unique identifier. You think about it as like a big digital warehouse where each item, which is the object, has its own tracking number and its own detailed label. Now, whether that item is a single photo or a very large database backup. S3 stores these objects in containers called buckets, and that's the top level organizational unit within S3. And you can even have like folder paths and stuff. They're not technically folders, but it works that way. This approach allows S3 to scale virtually without limit while maintaining consistent performance. Literally 9/11s of durability. Like, it is really hard to lose data out of S3 once you get it in there, assuming you keep paying your bill. And there's the origin of the problem. S3 isn't like having a private file server you accidentally expose to the internet by opening up some firewall rules. Anything and everything in S3 is potentially internet accessible because S3 is designed to store and serve files over the internet. In fact, when you name a bucket, even if it's going to be a private bucket that you never share outside your own organization or your own AWS account, that name has to be globally unique on the internet just in case you want to make it public later. S3 is also It is positively ancient by cloud standards. It was released in 2006, which means it can legally vote and enlist in the military. However, it is not old enough to drink without a fake ID. Not that I would condone that. This was long before things like IAM and resource policies and AWS organizations and many of the other controls that we've been working with over the almost year that we've been doing these labs. It has some really weird behaviors, like you can share a bucket with someone and they can fill that bucket with files and then you pay the bill, but you can't actually own or delete those files. Yeah, that's the weirdness of S3. Now, today we're going to focus on one of the mechanisms of S3 called access control list. And this is how a lot of the original data became public. I actually still use this sometimes, even though you're not supposed to. I've mostly stopped, and we'll go into some of the reasoning why. The thing is with S3, it has multiple mechanisms for controlling access because Amazon has just kind of added stuff over time as the service has matured, but it hasn't really shut off completely the old stuff because that would break things. In some cases, for some very large organizations have been using Amazon since 2006. So some of this is due to the age, and some of it is just because of the wide use of things that maybe not are ideal, but have been, out there for so long. Now, for our purposes, I like to distill down the main mechanisms to ACLs, resource policies, and identity-based policies. And there's more, but for the most part, they kind of fall within those headings. S3 supports these things called access control lists, or ACLs. And those are supported at the bucket or the object level. That's going to be our focus today. You really shouldn't use them. They are disabled by default. We're going to learn why, but yes, we are going to learn how to use them in just a moment. Bucket policies are the resource-based policies and the preferred method for managing access. We've used those in a previous lab when we were setting up some of our CloudTrail stuff, and we are going to use them more in the next lab as we learn through the different mechanisms. You can also control access using IAM, but that really only works for users, groups, and roles that's within your AWS account. It doesn't help you define like what IP addresses from out there on the internet can access them. Now, the thing about ACLs is they are weird compared to anything else we've covered in AWS because it's an older mechanism from back when dinosaurs ruled the earth. AWS defines them as a sub-resource of a bucket or an object, and they define which Amazon accounts or groups, including the entire internet, can have access. I mean, look, they're written in XML. They're not even written in JSON. The Amazon documentation itself says, and I quote, "A majority of modern use cases in Amazon S3 no longer require the use of ACLs. We recommend that you keep ACLs disabled except in unusual circumstances where you need to control access for each object individually." End quote. That said, I run into them all over the place. I guarantee you're going to run into them. And when I say run into them, I don't mean in the hi, nice to meet you way, but more like the, oh, look at that nice tree. I wonder if it's going to get out of my way. The TLDR is ACLs are antiquated, complicated, and don't use them. And rather than trying to cover everything about ACLs, there are some important bits I do need to cover. We're going to learn how to use them today because you have to be able to recognize them when you're working within an AWS account, even though you're hopefully never going to use them yourself. Now, as I mentioned, they are effectively disabled by default on new buckets. And to use them, you need to change a setting called S3 object ownership. We'll do that today. Now, the default for object ownership is the bucket owner. So it's your bucket, you own the objects in it, you fully have control. And it sounds weird, but remember, S3 is originally designed so you could give somebody else access to store their stuff in your bucket. And you could actually have an object in your bucket that you couldn't delete if they owned it in your bucket and you didn't have the right permissions that they would control whether or not to give you. Now, when it's set to bucket owner, all the ACLs are effectively disabled, and you need to use bucket policies, which is next week's lab and what we did previously for CloudTrail. If you do enable ACLs, the options are that bucket owner preferred or object writer. So owner preferred means you're going to own all those objects, even if somebody writes something in your bucket. But object writer means that they're going to own the object and you're paying for their bill. Like, there really shouldn't be any legitimate use cases for this anymore. If you know of one, just let me know. I can't remember the last time I encountered that scenario where you wanted to let somebody else store stuff in your account that you paid for that they owned. Access, if you again disable bucket owner and you move into bucket owner preferred or object writer, is then granted based on something called a grantee. And that gets into deep weirdness with canonical IDs that can involve email addresses and root accounts. It is like really old stuff and it's beyond the scope of today. If you do run into that, it's pretty easy to figure it out if you look at the documentation. I just don't want to take the time today to cover it. And I honestly, I can't remember the last time I encountered some of those weird situations. What I am most likely to encounter, and what I guarantee you will encounter at some point, is somebody will set the grantee to all users, and that means it's public. And this is how all these data leaks happen. So again, think about the steps. And there's a step I've skipped that we're going to get into in the actual lab part, but you first have to enable the ACLs, and then you have to set the grantee for all users. So that's 2 steps right there before something can be made accidentally public. Now, the permissions for ACLs are read or write, and there's separate permissions for reading or writing the ACLs themselves. So if you set like read to all users, the entire internet can read your data. This is one of the most common sources of these leaks. If you set write to all users, the entire internet can host their Napster libraries in your bucket. And let's be honest, it's not going to be Napster libraries. And don't make me say what you'll really be hosting, because this is a family-friendly channel, and I want to make sure I don't have to check that little checkbox in YouTube. ACLs can then apply to buckets and objects. So each individual object can have its own permissions. So you could have a public bucket, but you could have public objects, or you could have a private bucket with public objects. So this all gets ugly very quickly, and even just scanning and looking for object level permissions is really time consuming and very resource intensive. Look, I'm not trying to scare you. I've been talking fast because there is a lot to cover here. ACLs are messy, but we really don't use them that much anymore. And I'm not saying the resource policies, the bucket policies are perfect, but you'll see why as we get into those, it becomes much more manageable. Amazon has also added extensive support to detect and prevent S3 exposures. We're going to cover all of those in the various labs in this data security block. But because you are highly likely to encounter these access control lists, not that you will ever use them yourself, I want you to see what they look like and how they're misconfigured. So with that, let's jump in the lab. We're going to change a few settings so we can actually use them. And you're going to see it's like 3 layers of changing security settings before you can make something public. And then we're going to make a bucket public, and we're going to leave it there because we're going to use that later for our detection as well as our prevention labs. From our sign-in portal, let's go over to test account 1 and our administrative access or administrator access. Now, there's no CloudFormation this week. We're going to go directly into S3 and create everything by hand. So let's go into S3. Now, coming up with the default here to just go ahead and create a bucket, we're not going to do that. We need to change a security setting first that I'm not going to describe today. We're going to do a whole lab on it, but we do need to turn it off. Because if you click on this menu on the left side, and you go to block public access settings for this account, we need to make sure that block public access is disabled. And it looks like it is here. So I'm going to just double check, show you how to change that. We're going to hit edit. We want to make sure that that is disabled and then save changes. So I thought it was enabled by default in new accounts. So possibly I turned it off. I don't think I did. But you want to make sure it looks exactly like this. Block all public access is off. All of these need to be turned off. That's a really important setting. We are going to spend more time on that later. All right. From there, we want to go into buckets. And again, we're only going to scratch the surface. S3's got a lot inside of it, but we're going to focus on the important parts of it. And today we're going to learn how to make buckets public using ACLs. First thing we need to do is to create a bucket. Now it's going to be a general purpose bucket, and don't worry about these other settings. A lot of this is for storage experts. Now your name, as it says right here, bucket name must be unique within the global namespace and follow different conventions. You can read those for the details. The short version is that I'm going to go rmogul -slaw- a bunch of random characters. And that's so that it's going to be globally unique. Obviously, all of you could potentially copy this once I release the screenshots in the video, but that's what we're going to go with. And use your first initial, last name, -slaw- random characters. That's probably going to be safe. It'll give you an error if you don't. Keep it all lowercase. And again, if you want to see those rules, just click on this, opens it up in another window, and it's got to be between 3 and 63 characters, and it's only lowercase, and we won't go into all of the reasons why. I actually have some with uppercase in there. That's how old some of my S3 buckets are. Scroll down. This is the big change we need to make. Object ownership, and let me zoom in here. Not ACLs disabled, but we want to enable ACLs. And it's it. Remember, right here, Amazon's like, don't do this. Don't be stupid. You didn't need this. Well, we're going to do it this way. We're also going to leave it as bucket owner preferred. We're not going to change any of our write permissions because even I'm not stupid enough to do that. We're going to open up some read permissions. Then our account block public access wasn't turned on, but you'll notice this is defaulting to bucket block public access. Uncheck that box. So we need to make sure that that is unchecked so that we're able to actually go ahead and make this public. And it's going to warn you. It's like this stuff might become public, and I acknowledge. Now look, all of these warnings are here. These warnings are not there if you do things via API, and that's a really important point to understand, is that when you do the API stuff, that's where you can make a lot of these mistakes. Scroll down. We're not going to play with any of the encryption. By default, everything in S3 is encrypted. We're going to do some encryption labs later. We're going to leave the basics here. Let me double check the advanced settings, and we're not going to mess with the advanced setting. There's like layers in depth. This is a really advanced service. It's been around for a long time. We're just going with the basics, and let's create bucket. Now, when this is done, we have a bucket, and I want to click into the bucket. And then once I'm in the bucket, if I go to properties, you can see all the various settings, but all the security is going to be under permissions. And the permissions overview. And see, it's going to give you some warnings right here at the top, but we haven't done that yet. All right, so our block public access is turned off. We do not have a bucket policy, so right now, nobody has any access to this. And we have our object ownership set. But we're here to cover ACLs. So I want you to scroll down. And remember I mentioned there's those grantees and there's the weird stuff. You've got like canonical IDs, everyone, authenticated users, or an S3 log delivery group. Like this is really old and archaic stuff. Right now, our account with some weird thing called a canonical ID that we aren't going to talk about has list and write permissions for object and read and write for the bucket ACL. So this is what I would expect. This is read and write. This is read and write. Now, remember I said the ACL permissions to look at the ACLs and the permissions to look at the objects are different. Let's go ahead and edit. We're going to make this public. Go to edit, everyone. Let's get a nice framing here. Everyone, public access. We're going to let everyone list. So that means they're going to be able to see everything that is in this bucket. Now, if I go with read for the ACLs, that means that they're going to be able to access objects in the bucket as well. So list is show the directory. Read is read all the files. That's the short way to think about it. I understand the high risk here. Do not try to mess with write. And it looks like they've actually disabled that capability. So I almost take it back. I don't realize Amazon had shut that down. In retrospect, I am now remembering that they shut that down. You could also grant access directly to other AWS accounts, but we're going to make it public. And a lot of warnings here, and I'm going to hit Save Changes. At this point in time, when I go into, my buckets, you're going to see here that, they changed it again. User interface changes. If I view these analyzer results and it's not turned on, so that's unfortunate. Go back to the buckets here. It used to just tell you right here if it was potentially public, and it looks like that's a recent change here. So this is later we will turn on Access Analyzer. That's actually one of the labs we've got planned out. So now of my buckets, I've got this bucket here, and if I go into the permissions that you scroll down, you can see that this is currently a public bucket, and people can go in and view and make any of the data within that bucket. That's it. That's how easy it is. And we had to make a couple of changes. We had to turn off block public access. Then we had to set object ownership, and only then could we make it public. It has not always been this hard. This used to be the only security mechanism. People would come in and just make things public from here. And it's kind of interesting because I actually went out of my way when I started building these labs to start shifting away from using these public ACLs, which is how I have previously delivered all of my free content publicly, and moving more into the bucket policies, which we're going to learn about next week. And that's just the overview of how we're going to cover this. Is we're going to go make it one bucket public via ACLs. We're going to make another one public. And you notice there's no objects in there. We're not exposing any data. Then we're going to make our next one public using the bucket policies. Then I'm going to we'll turn on Access Analyzer to learn how to detect those. And then we're going to learn the nuances of block public access. And then we're going to get into a couple of other things. But that's the core of these labs around S3 security, because these are the most common ways that things will become public. All right, a lot of lecture, really quick lab, but you do need to have this set up so that we can have fun later when we go over our detection and prevention. Have a great week.